Yeah, nostalgia helped sell this terrible book. Here's a very detailed, extensive review. I would call it a fallible ideas list worthy analysis. This is one of the better online forums that no one's ever heard of, I think. I mean, it's not small, but I've never really seen anyone ever mention it other than Justin, who told me it existed. Because mostly only people involved with lawyer stuff know about it, I think. Maybe some finance guys as well. As you can see from some of the usernames, it is not SJW friendly. Contrary to the many people's assumption, having usernames like this does not in fact mean that the discussion quality is low, and Charles 12 has a very high quality analysis of a mainstream book that fooled millions or hundreds of thousands, I don't know, of gullible people. It has almost as many Amazon reviews as a Game of Thrones, which are overwhelmingly 4 and 5 stars, and the film made $500 million, and there's a sequel being made. So, super successful book that got very good reviews from New York Times, Wired, NPR, and Patrick Rothfuss, who is a fantasy author who I don't like, but he's popular and shit. And so it's not just fooling the lay people, but it's getting positive reviews from authority figures, including like an actual author who ought to have some judgment or whatever, but I thought his own book was bad, The Name of the Wind, so maybe that's why. But on the other hand, Brandon Sanderson, who I think is really good, recommended Patrick Rothfuss, who I think is bad. So I think it's partly they just all recommend each other. It's like the popular people praise the popular people and just pass around recommendations, so everyone in the in crowd wins and everyone not in the in crowd loses. I think there's a lot of that going on, and people, they just don't want to offend the other people with large audiences. So there's a lot of sucking up to the people with power. There's also sucking up to like minorities, like the whole diversity hire kind of shit. There's that. Like Brandon Sanderson recommended a book that was really bad. Like Rothfuss's book was like normal bad fantasy, like, you know, it was okay. It wasn't super bad or anything. I just didn't like it, but I didn't think it was terrible. I just thought it was a bit boring and long and pointless and whatever. Like not exciting. As opposed to like Ready Player One is like actively really, really bad. And anyways, Brandon Sanderson recommended a different fantasy book that I read that was like one of the worst books I've ever read. And it was by a black female, if I remember correctly. And so I think there was some diversity shit going on there. It's this total sex fantasy where the main character is having sex with a dark god in this like largely abandoned castle area where there's some sort of politicking for power, and there's only like a couple characters. It's a very empty world. But it's basically like a Molly Sue thing, where the main character is just, you know, always wins, always powerful. Or Mary Sue, not Molly Sue. Yeah. So it's Mary Sue, and it's clearly like wish fulfillment by the author, like more blatant than your average fanfic. And somehow Brandon Sanderson was recommending it. And it included like literally her having sex with the dark god. With of course no negative consequences from the unwise promiscuity with the powerful male. But it's like Twilight to the extreme, you know, like fucking a vampire, but ramp it up to 11. Okay, so there's this nostalgia question, which I didn't actually think about much yet. But that's okay, let's make a podcast. Anonymous asks a question about nostalgia. Have Rand, Saws, or any of the other big thinkers anything to say on nostalgia? I've never been much for it, but as I have faced a rough half a year on a couple of fronts, personal as well as business, I have developed a strong nostalgia for the 80s and 90s. I understand it means some sort of yearning for a better past. Do you have anything to say on why so many people get nostalgic when they grow up? Why, when, and how to not get stuck in it? I think it is bad because it can take away one's focus of today and the future. Is it because we are not happy with where we are today? So I agree that it's generally bad, but not entirely bad. It's good to be introspective and to think about your life and your past, and more so recent things, like You know, you had a conversation yesterday, what could you have said differently so it would have turned out more to your liking? Rethinking, replaying in your head that kind of conversation is a good thing. It's how you learn to do better next time. And considering things from further in your past is a similar kind of activity, but you should be doing less of it. Like, the further back in time it goes, in general, then you should be giving it less thought. To the point where it's often zero thought unless it was particularly important. Like, if it's more than a month old and it's not important, then you probably shouldn't be thinking about it anymore. And then another tangential comment about nostalgia is it helped sell a very bad book called Ready Player One. And in the podcast description, I will put a link to a very extensive review of that book, which I thought was a very high quality review. A lot of research and effort went into it. It's very long. And I thought it was good, the review. It was a lot of detailed analysis. And it's not from a philosopher. He's not an FI poster, so it's like a different kind of person, but still doing good work of the type of, and it's kind of the kind of thing that FI would like to do, like textual analysis, understanding the details. There's a lot of criticism. He catches the author in contradictions and plot holes and stuff. So that's nice. It's on a free speech forum where you can say naughty things that SJWs would not approve of. And so it's nice that good forums exist with good content. It's not a perfect forum by any means, but I'm happy it exists, and there's a decent amount of decent quality stuff there. Contrary to people's belief that if you're allowed to say mean things or mean words, then clearly everyone must be stupid and all their ideas must be wrong or whatever, you know? People can be like rude to each other while actually making good points. And by contrast, you see a lot of discussions where people are being all polite to each other while making terrible points and no one's calling each other out on anything. Anyways, I'll link that. So back to nostalgia. I don't recall Rand or Saws saying anything in particular about it, or DD. But the thing I was saying about replaying conversations in your head, I'm pretty sure DD wrote an email praising that and talking about why it was good. I think that was like an old TCS email or something. I forgot where it was from. But I believe he did that. I think a lot of nostalgia is because people are bad at updating their preferences. So they form preferences like when they're teenagers or young adults, and then they just never change them a lot. And then the world changes, the culture changes, so they become out of date. And you see this like with fashion, where people are wearing clothes that are 10, 20, 30 years out of date because they didn't update. And, you know, that's not a big deal. Who cares if you're not looking fashionable? Like, unless you're trying to look fashionable, it's okay. But if your preferences for movies, TV shows, music, etc. get really out of date, then it's awkward because you have to find old stuff. You don't get to enjoy the new stuff. So that's why you get like nostalgic, or it's a reason. Because you're finding that there's all this new stuff being created that you don't like, but you remember liking this old stuff. So you want more of the old stuff that's like what you already like, because you're not appreciating the new stuff. Now, to some extent, that can be your fault because you're failing to learn what's good about the new stuff. You're not putting effort into understanding it. You know, your thinking is stagnant. You're not seeing the value in the new things. But also, sometimes there can be downward trends, and so the older stuff can actually be better. On average, worldwide, things are getting better, not worse, so things trend upwards on average. But for any particular area, like music or movies or something, it's totally possible for there to be downward trends for years or decades even. Especially for like certain aspects of them. Like, one example in gaming, when 3D games came out, they got a lot of attention and development effort. And they have some advantages over 2D games, and they also have some disadvantages. And so there was a period of time where not enough 2D games were being made and not enough effort was going into 2D gaming. And 3D games are definitely not strictly better. So there ought to be effort into 2D and 3D. And I think there is now. Mobile has helped it and indie development has helped it. and 2D games tend to be easier to make. And they tend to be more suited for certain types of games, like strategy games. But there are other reasons to have them. Anyways, so I think there was maybe a period of 10 years where 2D games were getting underserved, and that has improved lately. Another trend in gaming is it's gotten more and more mainstream, which has resulted in games being easier and easier. And so nostalgia for games that were actually hard enough makes sense. And there are certainly good players who play primarily old games because they don't like how it's been dumbed down to make it easy enough for the masses of stupid people to succeed without much thought. Because a lot of people don't want to think, but collectively they have more money than the people who do want to think. When gaming was for like the early adopters in the computer industry, it was harder. And it was also because back then games were a lot smaller, and so by making them hard, they would make them longer. But nowadays, they're pandering to the mainstream, not the early adopters, and they're able to make big, long games. They don't need difficulty to stretch out the time it takes to finish the game. And so a lot of games really suck now. Not all of them, there's some good games, and there's a variety. And I think overall things are better, but there's definitely some major downward trends. And so downward trends can cause like nostalgia, especially when you don't understand what's going on. You just sort of vaguely know that you liked something better about some of the past stuff. Nostalgia can be more suspect when it's not about a specific thing. If you just like certain old games, maybe not a big worry, probably fine. But, and the same if you like some specific old movies or music or something, or old clothes, probably not a big concern. But if it's just sort of generally remembering the past fondly and sort of wishing you were living in the past and not liking your current life in general, rather than just having specific complaints about specific products, then maybe you have more of a problem. Especially if you're unhappy now and you just like wish you were in a better situation, or if you want like a do-over on part of your life, if you regret some of your choices, to like fondly remember before you made those choices that you regret. Those kinds of things can be bad. Like you need to make your current life good and focus most of your thinking on your current situation and living a life that you like and you're happy with and whatever, and solve your problems. Like you don't want to escape from your problems and ignore them. You want to actually solve them and do something about them. N asks, when you introspect, how do you make sure you're being honest and are not rationalizing? Okay, first point, read my essay on lying. It is at rationalessays.com/lying. The link will be in the description. Second point, practice introspecting with easier stuff. If you get good at it with stuff where there's less temptation to lie, and it's easier to check if you're lying in some way, find things like that, where it's easier to get it right, you're not tempted to lie, you have some way to actually check whether you're right or wrong about what you introspected. Look for opportunities like that. So start with the easy stuff and get better at it and check that you're doing it right and work your way up to introspecting about harder stuff. Third point, think critically about it. Cross-check some of your opinions against each other and look for internal contradictions. Look for ways your story doesn't make sense. Look for discrepancies. Look for vague parts where you're leaving things out. You might be hiding some lying to yourself in the part where you don't fully verbalize what you're saying. Next point, talk to other people and give them feedback and criticism. If you can get good at analyzing other people's stories, introspections, beliefs, claims, etc., you can catch when they're being honest or rationalizing, not honest or rationalizing. Then you'll be better at catching yourself. Like it's easier to start with noticing other people's lies and rationalizations than your own. So work on that, practice that, and don't just form judgments, but also try to check them. So you can often form an opinion of someone, and then you keep talking to them, and then more information comes out, and you can find out whether you're right or wrong in your earlier judgment. So in that way, you can get better and better at making judgments with less information. You try to form early judgments, and you see what information you really need to form a judgment, and what information is unnecessary. And then you get more information. You can check whether you're right, and you can keep doing that and getting better at it. And then the next thing is to share your thinking with other people and get criticism, get feedback. You can do this about your exact thoughts, or you can also do it about hypothetical situations that you think share some important attributes with your situation. Being able to figure out what's actually important about your situation, what the impersonal parts that matter are, being able to differentiate what's parochial and what's not parochial, what are the key concepts and what's irrelevant, is actually an important skill. Like, that's part of understanding your own situation, is being able to do that. So if you can't hypotheticalize your situation, that's an indication you don't understand it very well. And again, you can work your way up. You can hypotheticalize easier things. You can hypotheticalize things where you don't need privacy, there's no concern, just for practice, and you can get better at it over time, work your way up. And you can also get feedback on that. You can tell people, you can hypotheticalize something and get some comments, and then also share the full version and then ask about your hypotheticalizing. Did you hypotheticalize well or not? You can get critical feedback if you show people both your hypothetical version and then also the full real version. As long as you're doing it with practice stuff where you don't actually need privacy, then that'll work fine. You can also get feedback on your theories on privacy. You can discuss that topic. And then you can learn common cultural stuff. So a lot of your errors and ideas and whatever else will follow standard patterns. Like, sometimes you'll be unique or have your own idea, but lots of times you'll have the standard view. So studying the standard view can help you. You can also work on your thinking skills in general. If you get better at logic and critical argument and whatever, you'll be better at catching your own logical errors and argument errors and so on. So improve your skills, work your way up step by step, etc. Get feedback. It also helps if you break things into parts. If you take complicated issues and you figure out how to separate them into reasonably independent parts that you can work on separately. Similar to hypotheticalizing, if you can't do that, it's a sign of lack of understanding of some aspect of what you're dealing with. And if you can do it, that helps indicate that you understand what you're doing, and also makes it easier. And that is a skill you can practice in general and get better at before using it in the hard cases. Also, listen to my podcasts related to introspecting, and also go to fallibleideas.com and then go to the emotions essay at fallibleideas.com/emotions. And that is relevant to a lot of the problems people have in this area. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about introspection that I forgot was that it helps to verbalize your introspection. Put it in words. And the best words are written words, and then review them later. So you're not just considering, am I lying to myself right now? You can review what you wrote 3 weeks ago, and then see if you're lying to yourself then, when you have more of a fresh perspective. Anonymous asks, when, if ever, do you think it is appropriate to voice disagreement against the way someone is parenting their child? Presumably there are situations where one sees bad parenting and doesn't want their silence to be interpreted as sanction. Yeah, so if it would be sanction, then you should speak up. That's basically the criteria. Like, if you're hanging out with your friend and they're being mean to their kid, you ought to speak up. You have to say you don't agree, and the kid has to hear it. You can't just say it privately to the parent, or from the kid's perspective, you're on the parent's side presenting a united front. However, if you just see strangers at the park and they're not even talking to you, then you can just leave it alone just because you overhear something. It's not your problem. But if those strangers at the park involve you in some way, like they're giving their kid orders about, he has to say sorry to you because he made noise in your vicinity or something, then you are in danger of being drawn into it where the kid sees you as agreeing with his parents, and that is preferable to avoid. So it's good to say things like, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine, he's not bothering me, stuff like that, which is not very confrontational. It's not that hard to say, and it helps the kid have a better sense of reality. because he knows your actual opinion. He knows like his parent is being unreasonable rather than his parent actually being right about what strangers think and want. So you have to think about whether you're involved, and most involvement has some voluntary element. Like you chose to go to a park where there are parents and children, or you chose to spend time with a friend and be friends with a person who has a kid. And so you're exposing yourself to parenting behavior and putting yourself in a situation where you're involved with it, which makes you have to speak up more. And that can be a problem. A lot of people don't like criticism of their parenting, so it can be hard to be friends with a bad parent. If you think someone is a bad parent, they're not going to like that. They don't want that kind of friend. But you shouldn't just constantly lie to them for years in order to be friends with them. You should find people who share your values more, who you get along with better. N asks about today's movies and the philosophy they portray. He says hero movies include the fallen part of the hero more than the heroic. For example, Logan is the highest rated X-Men movie and has Wolverine losing his abilities and Xavier becoming demented. I've not seen the movie. He says that a lot of self-proclaimed intelligent people say that they like this stuff. And then he gives quotes from Rand. I'm going to read the quotes and see if I have comments. The basic purpose of art is not to teach, but to show, to hold up to man a concretized image of his nature and his place in the universe. That sounds right. Art is a bit of a different thing than like intellectual writing. So art should represent the world and show ideals and values and things to aspire to and whatever. Art is not so much about explaining. If you wanted to explain something, you should just write an explanation. Do some approximation, that sounds pretty reasonable. Like a sculpture is not going to explain, a painting is not going to explain. Even a novel, a fiction book, is not going to explain a ton in general. Rand cheated a little by having Galt give a 75-page speech in the middle of a fiction novel, and the speech itself is a non-fiction speech. It is, him explaining philosophy. It's like she put a non-fiction book inside a fiction book. But in general, if you're focusing on the plot, you're not going to explain everything. People will see what happens, and they'll have to figure out some things for themselves. Of course, when you do explain everything, people still have to think. Also, I agree that a lot of movies are not very good. I have not been watching very many movies for years, and I've been watching less TV as well. Right, next quote. The romanticists did not present a hero as a statistical average, but as an abstraction of man's best and highest potentiality, applicable to and achievable by all men in various degrees according to their individual choices. Right, so a hero is not supposed to be typical or mundane. You sort of take the best of everyone and put it together in one person, and that's what the hero looks like. So in each trait or attribute, it's what someone can be striving for, which is achievable. Sometimes you even go further than that, and you can have a hero that's not realistic in the foreseeable future, but has things that you imagine and you think would be good. That comes up not just with heroes, but more with like societies and technologies. And you have like far future science fiction books. And some of those books are not very good, and they sort of transplant a lot of present ideas, values, cultural practices, etc. into the far future. But some of them are interesting, and they envision a future which is actually different in important ways. And then you can wonder, like, does that future make sense? How could we get there? Can we get any of it soon? Would we even want it or like it? If it's so different than what we have now, you have to actually evaluate it. It can be hard to evaluate if it's good because it's so different than the values you're used to evaluating. Anyway, so yeah, you don't want a statistical average. You don't want a mundane, boring person. A lot of TV and movies try to make relatable characters. And in particular, they make the main character very bland. That way, the viewers think, I could do that. There's a lot of that, where they want a character who doesn't seem better than you. People want a character with no strong opinions so they never get thrown out of the show where they're like, oh, I wouldn't do that, I would never do that. You know, when they have that reaction, then they don't identify with the main character. You get a lot of super bland main characters. Super generic, so that everyone can identify the character with the character because everything the character thinks and does is vague, and he avoids ever committing himself to anything that 10% or more of the audience wouldn't like. Next quote. That which is not worth contemplating in life is not worth recreating in art. That seems reasonable. If you wouldn't want to think about it, why would you paint it? Or sculpt it, or write a novel about it? Next quote. Pity for the guilty is treason to the innocent. Now that sounds like Ayn Rand. I agree with that. I like that. People ought to focus more on helping the innocent and the good and the best and the great and the heroic people. Help them be even better, rather than sort of ignoring them and not caring about them and focusing on the bad people, the worst people, and especially the malicious ones, the ones who are guilty of something instead of merely unlucky. And a lot of the poor people are guilty of something. Not all of them, but a lot. A lot of the unfortunates, the victims, played some role in their own situation, especially in the good countries like America. Whereas if it's like a third world country, then a lot more of the unfortunate people it's not their fault. Their government caused their bad situation by treating them unfairly and using violence and taking their money and so on. Anyways, there's so much effort to help the people in bad situations. And a lot of it is like pouring water into a leaky bucket. Like they created some leaks in their bucket, and that's why they don't have much water, and then you keep giving them more water, and you don't give adequate respect or attention or help or resources to the great people who can actually do a lot with it efficiently. So Ayn Rand about bright young people giving up, perishing, extinguishing their minds. And she said, quote, in lonely agony, they go from confident eagerness to bewilderment, to indignation, to resignation, to obscurity. And while their elders putter about, conserving redwood forests and building sanctuaries for mallard ducks, nobody notices those youths as they drop out of sight one by one, like sparks vanishing in limitless black space. Nobody builds sanctuaries for the best of the human species. And that's really awful, that a lot of people are more interested in helping the poor and unfortunate, and even animals, rather than smart young people. And then what happens is it's hard to get a critical mass of smart young people, and they're all surrounded by people they don't like who don't like them, and they all give up individually, alone. Whereas if there were sanctuaries for the best people, they could meet each other more. And there's not enough effort going into that kind of thing. Giving them funding, giving them meeting areas and housing and so on. You could do that for the smartest people and help empower them to be great and do great things, which would overall end up helping everyone the most. Because if you help really effective people be more effective, you're getting a lot larger return on investment. Next quote. If one saw, in real life, a beautiful woman wearing an exquisite evening gown, with a cold sore on her lips, the blemish would mean nothing but a minor affliction, and one would ignore it. But a painting of such a woman would be a corrupt, obscenely vicious attack on man, on beauty, on all values, and one would experience a feeling of immense disgust and indignation at the artist. There are also those would feel something like approval and who would belong to the same moral category of the artist. Tangentially, all of the quotes I read are from the Romantic Manifesto, from the person who asked the question. However, the thing I read about the sanctuaries for the best of the human species is from the inexplicable personal alchemy chapter of The Return of the Primitive. Now, as to the painting with the cold sore, I agree with the point there. In real life, you might get a cold sore on your lip, and it might be a minor blemish, and somewhat ignorable. However, in art, there's no need to put in a cold sore. Everything you include in a painting should have a purpose. You don't need to include a cold sore unless there's some reason to. Otherwise, it just makes it dirtier or uglier. Like, cold sores are a bad thing. In a better world, cold sores would not exist. We would have a cure for them, and we would just get rid of them. We wouldn't want them to be part of our life, or part of our world, part of our reality. So why would we put them in our art unnecessarily? Cold sores affect our lips, but they don't affect our paintings. Our paintings are immune, so unless the artist intentionally creates a cold sore on purpose. And why would you do that? Cold sores are bad. You simplify to the point that no one can tell if you understand the article more than introductorily. Like, you understand some of the basics, but then you would have to write more depth of what you're saying for anyone to know if you understand very much, or you could actually do it yourself. Like, you understand that at a soundbite level, but your post doesn't express whether you understand more than that or not. And also, you didn't write a summary of the article. You wrote summaries on like a paragraph by paragraph basis. If you actually had to summarize the article, that's a harder task because you decide what's important in the article. Whereas what you did is you took every paragraph, made no judgments about whether it was important overall, and wrote just a few words about each part. So you weren't making judgment calls where you had to think about what's the point of the article, what matters the most, etc. So you did it in a less thoughtful way than the standard way of summarizing things. It's an easier way. It's okay to start that way if that's all you can do. Like, it's perfectly fine to start there and work up. But if you're thinking that that is a finished product, then you're mistaken. Quickly rising is a group that is a phrase, an adverb, and an adjective, and then quickly rising modifies sun exactly the same as very dark ball. You have like the phrase of adverb and adjective, very dark, modifying ball. It's the same thing. Here we have the participle hitting with an object, and then the participle phrase, including the object, modifies man. So you can't just view hitting as a regular adjective. In this case, it works like a regular adjective because it has no subject and no object. At least not directly. Like, it's implied that the object of rising, the subject of rising is sun. We're talking about a sun rising, so you have an implied subject for rising, but there's no subject written there. Whereas here, you have an actual explicit object of ball to go with your participle, and participles can do that because it is a verb that can take an object. You shouldn't do things that you think aren't going to work in general. If someone is really specific and they say do this exact thing, and I think it'll work, and you want to try out their judgment, that's okay. But I don't think I gave you like really specific instructions to do an exact thing. I think there was like a lot of flexibility where you could use judgment about what you do. And so when there's judgment called by you, and then you're doing something you think is bad, then you're using bad judgment. You're going against your own judgment. I think, Zhao, that your main issue is you just don't participate much. You're not very involved. You don't do much. If you want to learn, you're going to have to work on learning regularly. Just put in more effort and try a variety of things. You don't want like one little project like this to actually be a big deal. It should just be one project out of many. I like the tip list and that you're using it because it's not just a bunch of generic tips for all of life that you'll like forget about. Because they're grammar specific, you can actually like review your tips when you're doing grammar. And so you can end up actually using them. Because some people, they do like a lot of, in hindsight, I should have done X, therefore I will add X to my list of 507 life tips, and then they never use any of them. Whereas if you have like a few grammar tips, you can actually use them every time you do grammar until you get better at them. You don't want to have too many. Like if you had 30, that would be too many, but you can learn to get used to and make like habitual or autopilot-y, say 5 tips at a time, or maybe even 10. And it's a way of putting effort into what you're doing. Like it's visible effort that you're actually trying to learn stuff and doing something about it. If you're going to analyze the fragment, shouldn't you note that there's an implied that? It's a debt that she can never repay, I think. So that would affect your analysis and markings and stuff. And see, that also explains why it's a fragment even though it has a verb, can, or can repay. Like, can repay is a verb. It's a finite verb even. So you're saying it's a fragment even though there's a finite verb. And the reason for that is the finite verb isn't a nested that clause. So you guys sort of left out what was going on there. I think both of you did. I'm not paying close attention, by the way. I'm just occasionally commenting on things.